Welcome back to our interview series, Israel's Multi-Front Threats, where we examine each of the security challenges facing Israel as it fights to protect its citizens. Today we're focusing on the West Bank and the rising instability and violence fueled by Iran-backed terrorism. Long before October 7th, the Palestinian Authority's control over the West Bank was collapsing, allowing Hamas and Islamic Jihad to fill the vacuum and establish bases of operation. Since October 7th, Iran has sought to turn the West Bank into another front from which its terror proxies can attack Israel. As Israel fights Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in the north, we've seen the IDF carry out significant operations inside the West Bank to thwart terrorist attacks and eliminate terrorist infrastructure. Joining us today from Israel is Enia Krivine, Senior Director for the Israel Programs and National Security Network at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and an expert on Israeli security matters. Enia, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Corey.
We've all watched as the security situation in the West Bank has really deteriorated now for many years. It's now one of 7 fronts that Israel is defending against. What's been happening on the ground in the last 6 months post-October 7th, and what's the situation like in the West Bank today?
Thanks again. So, first of all, thank you so much for doing this segment. I think a lot of people are distracted from what's going on in the West Bank, and it's such an important arena. So I'm happy to dig in a little bit with you all. So I think you can go back to 6 months to October 7th, but I think to really understand what's going on in the West Bank, we have to go back just a tiny bit further. You could, choose your point. You can go back to Oslo. You can go back to 2015 when the ninth Intifada started, and there was sort of this uptick in violence in general. But the spot that I look at when I talk about the West Bank is March 2022. And that was when there was a spate of violence, of terror attacks in Israel. And within 2 weeks between March and April, there were over a dozen Israelis killed by terror, which was one of the highest sort of incidents in such a small time in years. And what we've seen since then is a steady uptick. And so what the important takeaway from that is this, what we're seeing now in the West Bank actually predates October 7th, but got worse after October 7th. So just to, one of the best ways to that I like to look at, one of the best sort of data sets that we have at FDD is just the amount of shooting incidents that have happened over the past several years. So Israeli data that you can find from the IDF it's one of the metrics that they track. So in 2019, there were 19 terror incidents involving guns. And in 2019, going forward in years, they doubled and tripled. And then finally in 2023, we tracked over 1,500 terror incidents with guns in the West Bank in Israel. So you can see that there's this very worrying trajectory, and it does seem to be getting worse and worse. And it's not just shootings. I mean, now the West Bank are getting ever more sophisticated weapons and munitions. You see IEDs, you see rockets, which is something relatively new and very concerning for Israel. And then, of course, terror tunnels, which they've uncovered in the recent weeks. And IDF just recently put together a new battalion to deal with a new unit to deal with the terror tunnels. So because of this ongoing trend in the West Bank, actually on October 7th, the vast majority of the IDF battalions were actually in the West Bank and not sadly on the Gaza border where they potentially should have been. So these two arenas are separate. They have their own trajectory, but they're very interlinked. And of course, Israel is fighting with both. And when it dedicates resources to one, it may come up short in another. So right now, as it looks at all these different fronts, the West Bank is one that is certainly battling. And I've heard from my sources in the IDF that there are more battalions in the West Bank now than there are in Gaza, even today.
Wow, it's an incredible and important context that you just laid out for us. And we know that at the center of that rising terrorism and those sophisticated weapons imports to the West Bank is Iran. And I want to ask you about Iran. This goes back well before October 7th, many years in terms of arming and funding those terror groups in the West Bank. Talk to us a bit about Iran's fingerprints and what's Iran doing today to cause that chaos in the West Bank.
So FDD actually tracks 19 different Iran-backed terror groups on Israel's borders. Now that includes Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank and Gaza. But of those 19 that Iran is funding, 8 of them exist within the West Bank. And this is all available on one of our visuals that we have up at FDD. but the way it's a very intentional strategy, like this ring of fire, as some call it, or this strategy of surrounding Israel with these Iran-backed militias is a very intentional strategy coming out of Tehran. So specifically, Hamas, I think, is the one that we should all talk about. It's obviously the most relevant. It's the biggest. It's the best funded of all of the Iranian-backed Palestinian regimes. And they have a significant presence in the West Bank. Not only are they essentially their own military in the West Bank, they're also a political movement. And they're huge. It just happened to be hugely popular in the West Bank. And that didn't change with October 7th. In fact, it doubled and tripled their popularity according to the Palestinian polls. So we know that Iran has a footprint. We know that they heavily rely on their proxies, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Those are the two biggest ones. But they have other ways of, they have other fingers in the pot as well. One that we heard a lot of, especially last year in 2023 and 2022, was the Lion's Den. And this was really interesting. They were kind of presented as this organic group of young men from these communities in the West Bank, specifically Jenin and Nablus. That's what were considered the sort of hot spots for the terrorist groups in general, but specifically Lion's Den. And I heard from a Palestinian contact of mine who attended a Lion's Den rally in Nablus in 2023 that he came to a rally. There were 80 members of Lion's Den, so they're all masked, and all of them were carrying M16s. And he looked at me and said, you know, those M16s cost about 60,000 shekels. 60,000 shekels is a lot of money, especially for the West Bank, especially for these young men who are usually in their late teens, early 20s. So there's no way that this is Palestinian funds. This is outside funding that's coming into the West Bank. So not only is Iran funding this sort of well-established Hamas Islamic Jihad, they're also funding these organic, younger, harder, less centralized groups like the Lion's Den and such, and they all work together. They all coordinate, and it's very unclear sometimes where one begins and one ends. So, but part of the reason they've been able to flourish is because of the lack of leadership and the lack of governance from the Palestinian Authority. And I hope we have time to get into that a little bit, because I think it's a huge factor playing into Iran's success in really embedding itself in the West Bank.
Absolutely. And I want to follow up on that very point. You touched on Nablus and Jenin, two of the real hotbeds for Iran-backed terror. There is a governing force in the West Bank for the Palestinians, the Palestinian Authority, and clearly they have completely lost control over those critical cities in the West Bank, allowing Iran to fill the void. So maybe you can spend a minute walking us through how we got to this point and how the PA lost that control.
Sure. So as you know, Corey, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the PA, was elected in 2005 to a 4-year term. He's now 19 years into that 4-year term, and he has not gone to elections. But it's not necessarily because he's the autocrat and he doesn't want to cede power. It's because he knows that he can't win another presidential election. And that's the reality, because his competitors in the West Bank, Hamas, are hugely popular, as we mentioned before, even before October 7th, but especially after October 7th. So he has no path to an election. And so what we've seen is as he's remained in place and he's refused to call presidential elections, he's losing more and more of his legitimacy in the eyes of Palestinians. And he's slowly losing control of some of these critical cities like Jenin and Nablus and Tulkarm and Tubas and other places. And what you see is within where he's losing control, you see more and more hotbeds of terrorism. But perhaps most troubling is recently you've seen IDF operations even in Ramallah. Now that is pretty shocking to someone observing what's going on in the West Bank, because Ramallah is his backyard. So if he can't control Ramallah, there's no hope of him regaining control in some of these Nablus and Tulkarm and other places.
Obviously, there's been a history of important security cooperation between Israel and Palestinian Authority security forces. I want to ask you about the Biden administration's perspective on the Palestinian Authority. They have said that they want to see a revamped and a revitalized Palestinian Authority take charge in Gaza and in the West Bank. Based on what you just laid out, do you see that as a possibility today?
So the short answer is no. I mean, it would be very hard at this point, given the things that we've talked about, for Abbas to create any kind of semblance of a democracy, because he's simply not popular enough, and neither is the Palestinian Authority, the government which he represents. The other huge barrier is that he still supports the funds for martyrs. So as he is, the Palestinian Authority is still essentially bankrolling terrorism and rewarding the folks that carry out terrorist acts and their families when they carry them out. And the worse the crime, the higher the stipend. So it's a very corrupt system. Because of this practice, the U.S. stopped funding the Palestinian Authority, and many European governments have also done the same. So it's very hard to see a situation where the PA can remain in control, given some of its problems. And it's also struggling to stay funded. It's struggling to tamp down on terrorism. So where does this leave us? I mean, Israel is spending more and more time. The IDF is more and more often finding itself in the West Bank, essentially establishing the security that is incumbent on the PA to supply itself. So it's a very difficult situation. And I don't see the PA sort of finding a way to revitalize itself if what Secretary Blinken and President Biden want is a democracy. You can have a moderate Arab government. Many exist in the region, but none of them are democracies. And I think that's where we get into trouble, is imagining that this could somehow, blossom in the West Bank with all of these problems that we see, sort of preventing that from happening.
And yet we've seen over many years the important security cooperation between Palestinian Authority security personnel and Israel. Talk to us a bit about the status of this cooperation. Why is it so important, and is it continuing today at the same rate that we've seen previously?
The cooperation worked very well for many years. And after the Second Intifada, when Abbas came to power, the U.S. eventually sent over a general to come and run point on the security coordination between Israel and Jordan and some European allies. And it has been largely successful. The Palestinian Authority security forces have been a credible U.S. partner for many years. However, that all started to change around the time the security situation started to get worse. And while it's still there and still credible, and the situation would be orders of magnitude worse without that security coordination, there have been some problems. Not only have the security forces been unable to put down some of the terrorist activity by Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and others, but there have also been instances of members of the Palestinian security forces actually being involved in terrorism. Now, obviously, the Palestinian security force is a massive force. I've seen reports that there are up to 30,000 members of the Palestinian security forces that are employed by the PA. So these incidents are right now in the minority, but they're gaining. And I think this all comes back to, you can't have a legitimate security force if you don't have a legitimate government that it answers to. So again, the PA and its lack of legitimacy and its inability to sort of win the hearts and minds of the people it governs has a trickle-down effect into the security forces. So much so that Fatah in recent months, since October 7th, has actually tried to take credit for the terrorism instead of rejecting it. So any revamp to revitalize the Palestinian Authority is going to have to finally full-throatedly denounce October 7th, and also finally reject terrorism and lead its people instead of being led. And this is a really tall order in the Middle East. Being the peacemaker is not always well rewarded here, but it's something that that any revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority is going to have to deliver to the Palestinians and to the Israelis.
And yet you touched on this a few minutes ago, the rising popularity in the West Bank for Hamas and for Hamas's terror tactics. You referenced recent polling. One recent poll that came out shows that 70% of Palestinians in the West Bank still support the October 7th attacks. Let me ask you to press on that a little bit further. Why is Hamas so popular in the West Bank? You've talked about Mahmoud Abbas and his long legacy of being in power, but why is Hamas holding on to that popularity among young Palestinians in the West Bank?
So I think that the narrative of resistance is very popular and very attractive. And also they don't see any credible leadership coming from Ramallah. And I think those are two very problematic issues. Another unfortunate tactic is that when Hamas kidnaps Israelis and manages these hostage exchanges, or Israeli hostages are being held, and this is not the situation we find ourselves in now post October 7th, where this is nothing new. Hamas has had a policy of kidnapping soldiers and civilians when they can and exchanging them for prisoners. And this is also a hugely popular tactic among the Palestinian people. So I think that we are a long way away from a credible, democratically elected Palestinian Authority. And I think that there has to be some sort of interim solution that Israel and the U.S. work towards in the meantime.
You've painted certainly a bleak picture as it relates to Iran's role in funding and arming terrorism in the West Bank, the popularity of Hamas in the West Bank. Clearly, America has an important role to play at this moment, both to keep Israel safe and to address Iran's support for terrorism. So from your perspective, you've studied this, you've watched American leadership and support over many successive administrations and Congresses. But at this moment, why is America's support so valuable?
So first of all, Israelis are incredibly and inherently pro-America. And seeing the support from the United States is something that Israelis feel deeply, not just at the leadership level or at the military level, but on your everyday Israeli walking down the street level. So I think that U.S. support and the special relationship between Israel and the U.S. is just critical on every level. But where the rubber meets the road is this U.S. security assistance, which allows Israelis to defend themselves by themselves. And right now we have a critical aid package, which is working its way through Congress. That should pass the $14.3 billion so that Israel can continue on this path of continuing to defend itself by itself. And also if it zeroes down other threats. I mean, when we're talking about the West Bank, of course, there's an ongoing war in Gaza and a looming war on Israel's northern border. And that money is critical to make sure that Israel can fight the wars it needs to fight. And I think that in addition to that, another thing is cracking down on Iran. I mean, as we've discussed, a lot of this funding, a lot of these weapons, a lot of these shipments, and just recently, Israel discovered its biggest stash of weapons that were being smuggled across from Jordan that were coming from Iran. It was included just a huge amount of heavy weaponry. And we know whose fingerprints are on all of these munitions. We know where they come from. And the U.S. has a unique power as a superpower to sanction Iran, to snap back the sanctions, to put more in place. And because if Iran doesn't have the financial cash flow, it can't support all of these terror proxies in the region. And that's a tool that only the U.S. can wield.
Enia Krivine, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your insights on this critical topic.
Thank you so much for having me.
Israel is fighting a multi-front war, and these growing threats in the West Bank underscore the urgent need to ensure Israel can defend its families. Each of us has a vital role to play. So please take action by texting the word Israel to 24722 and urging your members of Congress to deliver on the critical $14.3 billion emergency funding package for Israel. That's it for our episode today. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon.